I'm going to talk a little bit about modality and modal logic. The word modality, first of all, signifies, in this context, talk of possibility, necessity, and contingency. Things that could be the case, might be the case, things that have to be the case or couldn't possibly be the case, things that could have been otherwise, and things that couldn't have been otherwise. And this is the basic thrust of the topic. There are other uses of the term modality. For instance, in learning, in education, there is the idea that people have different modalities, that is, different ways of learning. Somebody might be visually oriented, or they might work better if they listen to a lecture. This is not what we have in mind here. The first thing to notice is that there are different kinds of talk about possibility. It's controversial how many different kinds there are. I'm not going to get into that conversation, trying to iron it out one way or the other. I'm going to list 5 different ways of talking. There's some controversy. The 5 that I list, it could be more, it could be less. Some people will think that a few of the categories I mentioned are better off thought of as the same category, and maybe somebody might think that I've left something out, but this is just to get the wheels turning. The first kind that I'll note is logical. So logical possibility, logical necessity. Each of these could have its own video. But just to start off the conversation, let's think about these as being rule-governed judgments. So we'll say that something is possible logically if the rules of logic permit it, and things are impossible if the rules of logic prevent that from happening or from being instantiated. Or, on the other hand, if something is necessary, then the rules of logic mandate it. An example of this would be a mathematical statement like 2 plus 2 equals 4. On standard assumptions, and that's a very important caveat, I might sometimes forget to say it, but every time I'm going through one of these examples or one of these categories, it's probably best to think of it as on standard assumptions. So this is the view that you might think of as the received view, what people will typically say as a first pass. Philosophy is replete with people who challenge received views, and that's a good thing. So if you take a contrary view, or if you have read somebody who takes a contrary view, and you're probably not going to find that depth of the conversation in this video or in any of my introductory videos. So on standard assumptions, something like 2 plus 2 equals 4 is necessary. And it's very common to think of this, it's a mathematical statement, but it's common to think of this as necessary in a logical sense, that there is no world in which 2 plus 2 does not equal 4. It's important to realize we're not talking about naming conventions. We're not saying that the numeral that we actually refer to by the name 2 couldn't have been named peanut butter and jelly instead. That's not the conversation. The conversation is about the actual number and the role of the addition operator and the role of the equal sign. And when you understand those terms, regardless of what they're named, you understand that 2 plus 2 equals 4. Similarly, 2 plus 2 could not equal 5 or 6 or 1. So it is logically impossible that 2 plus 2 equal anything other than 4. And once again, the way to think of this as a first pass might be something like just according to the rules of logic. Now, on the other side, let's say that's logic. Well, on the other side of the continuum, let's consider for a moment physical possibility. It's not physically possible for me to fly. It's not physically possible, say, for somebody to go faster than the speed of light on standard Einsteinian assumptions anyway. But when you think about these impossibilities, they don't seem to be logical impossibilities. That is to say, there's nothing logically the matter with the idea that I could fly. It's just that my body is put together in such a way that it's not possible given gravity and given the restrictions of this world. So we might consider that to be physical possibility. Sometimes this is called nomological possibility, but it basically is conformity to the rules that govern the world, the physical world. Now immediately there are going to be conversations about whether there are rules in the strong sense. Are there laws of nature? Are there scientific laws that can be discovered? And how should we understand those laws? Those are very important and interesting conversations, but we're going to table them for the time being, and we'll simply speak of rules in a very sort of quick and dirty sense. Physical possibility, impossibility, necessity is going to have to do with the rules of the physical world. Another kind, and I'm kind of jumping around in a principled way, I would like to show that there's a spectrum of talk. So another possible way is going to be to talk about epistemic or doxastic possibility. Now, these are, in principle, differentiable, doxastic and epistemic, but I'm going to toss them together and just sort of talk about the beliefs that people have. So if we talk about doxastic possibility, something that's a doxastic possibility for me may not be a doxastic possibility for you, because what we're dealing with here is the things that you already believe. So based on your current beliefs, what is possible or what is not possible? John Hawthorne, the philosopher, gives an example that appeals to me in this case. He talks in one spot about the idea that possibly William Shakespeare didn't write the works of Shakespeare, and that instead, let's say, Francis Bacon wrote the works of Shakespeare instead. And he says, in his opinion, that has a little bit of probability, maybe not a lot, but it has a little probability. And the point is, for some people who've never heard that this is even a possibility in some people's minds, they might think, well, that's just impossible. They might think it's impossible that William Shakespeare, the actor born in Stratford-on-Avon, is not the author of the works that are attributed to him. But for those who have, say, read Mark Twain's treatment of this question, and Twain rejected the idea that the actor was the real author, they might give a higher probability. So the question is it possible that somebody else wrote the works of William Shakespeare, possibly Bacon? All kinds of, this is not a video about that, but the point is that for a person who thinks of that as an option, it's probably because of the other beliefs that they hold. But at the same time, Hawthorne points out that if the Stratford man really did write the works of Shakespeare, then it's logically impossible that Shakespeare didn't write Shakespeare. It'd be like saying that it's possible that I'm not me. Now, there's an allied sense of possibility very closely tied to logical, and in some people's estimations, it actually collapses or is conflated with or comes to the same thing as logical possibility. It's sometimes referred to as metaphysical possibility. Examples of this, not uncontroversial, but one that you will commonly see, is that nothing can be red all over and green all over at the same time in the same respect. Physical possibility is the rules of the physical world. You might think of epistemic possibility as the rules that govern your beliefs interacting. And in this case, metaphysical possibility, if it is different, it would govern the rules of reality, but not restricted to physical reality and not logical space either. One way to think about it is that a logical contradiction, think about something like P and not P. P and not P on standard logical assumptions cannot possibly be true, because it would assert P something and then assert its negation, not P, at the same time in the same respect. Standard assumptions say that is necessarily false. But if we say nothing can be red all over and green all over, it isn't clear that red and green are in the same relation to one another as P and not P. That's possible that they are, and there are certain elaborations or certain translations of the colors. For instance, if we just think of 7 colors, Roy G. Biv, then we would think that it is possible to define red as the color that's not orange, not yellow, not blue, and so on. But if we do that, then we see that you could actually translate nothing is red all over and green all over into a statement that could be understood as embodying a logical contradiction. Apart from that, if you get kind of an intuitive fix, the idea of metaphysical is supposed to be slightly larger than, or possibly quite a bit larger than, physical possibility, because it would govern more broad possibilities than simply what happens to be the case in our physical universe. An example of that, as we already said, is nothing can go faster than the speed of light. It is possible that that is simply a peculiarity of our particular physical universe, and that had cosmic evolution gone a different way, the speed of light could have been different, or there could have been different limitations, and that speed limit, so to speak, wouldn't exist. Well, if you think that that's right, that there could have been other ways that cosmic evolution could have gone, and that that cosmic speed limit might not have existed, then you might think that it is a metaphysical possibility that something could go faster than the speed of light, even if it's not a physical possibility. That is, in our world, you can't do it, but it could have been the case that you could have done it had the world been different than it is. That's one way to understand metaphysical possibility. Finally, there is ethical, moral possibility, or sometimes referred to as deontic possibility. Not only is this moral category different talk in the sense of its subject matter, it seems to use different words as well. Consider a moral statement such as, murder is wrong. It's natural to think that such a proposition conveys the notion that it is never okay to commit murder. We might rephrase this slightly by saying, necessarily, murder is wrong. But it's not entirely clear how this relates to possibility or impossibility, in the senses that we have been talking about so far. For, unfortunately, murder is impossible is not just awkward, but false, as a glance at the nightly news readily confirms. It's not only possible, but all too frequently, it's actual. So to see how we might be able to understand moral modality, we have to do a bit of translation legwork. For instance, if we substitute the words permissible and impermissible for possible and impossible, we can get senses of how moral talk can and does have its own vocabulary. Now we can say that necessarily murder is wrong translates into something like murder is always impermissible, or murder is never permissible. And those are arguably true. This is a somewhat difficult idea, so let's try going over it once more. We're contrasting moral language with other kinds of modal language. Let's stick with our recent metaphysical example. If we say that nothing can be both red all over and green all over at the same time and in the same respect, we seem to mean that it is impossible for us to have such a paint job. It's a non-negotiable metaphysical rule that nothing can be red and green at the same time. Such a color scheme is inconceivable. However, at some level, we might be tempted to say that murder is wrong is a non-negotiable moral rule. And in some contexts, we do say things like murder is unthinkable. But surely we are forced to admit that whereas it is literally impossible to break a metaphysical rule, it is possible to break a moral one. People do it all the time. And this difference should make us wonder whether the word possible is being used in the same sense or univocally throughout. Not just possible, but words like necessary and so on. And that is the point. We should understand that modal talk sometimes expresses strict possibilities, or, so to speak, total impossibilities. For example, necessarily, nothing can be both a square and a circle at the same time. Squircles are totally impossible. Evidently, we can't even clearly imagine one, let alone draw one or make one. But moral rules, such as murder is always wrong, have to be thought of differently. In a moral context, in place of the words possible and impossible, we should speak instead of actions being permissible or impermissible. And when we make this change, it is possible, no pun intended, for us to think of moral talk as being a variety of modal talk. The point is that moral possibility and moral necessity doesn't place the same limitations on us, apparently, that other kinds of necessity do. So we're talking about very different types of possibility and necessity in different ways of speaking. I keep saying that talk about moral possibilities and necessities is very different from modal talk of other sorts. However, there are a few caveats, as there usually are, and some of these are especially worth mentioning since they point to deeper philosophical issues that may be of interest. In this vein, we shouldn't forget, firstly, that to the extent that there really are different categories of modal talk, each category is distinct from every other. This is to say that if we had indistinguishable categories, we wouldn't seem to have different categories at all. So the fact that there are differences is, in a sense, trivial. At the same time, trying to pin down exactly what it is that distinguishes one sort from every other is extremely difficult. For example, as a first pass, we might think that what we mean to point out in saying moral talk is different is that other categories, chiefly metaphysical and physical, unequivocally appear to be about or to describe an external, mind-independent world. But number one, doxastic epistemic talk is also somewhat odd in this regard. After all, what is possible for me to believe depends at least as much on what is already in my mind as it does on what really exists out there in the world. Thus, even if moral claims are subjective, it's not clear that they're unique in that regard. Number two, historically speaking, there are those who hold that logic merely discloses the laws of thought, so to speak. And one camp here favors the opinion that these laws are, at the end of the day, also subjective and perhaps contingent, but in any case, features of human psychology. And number three, many who resist this sort of psychologism do so by insisting that logical rules are objective features of the world after all. As such, the laws of logic would be independent of the contingencies and vagaries of human constitution, or of human creation, or evolution. Moreover, it's worth pointing out that some thinkers assert the objective truth of moral principles too. So it's by no means clear that a sharp line can be drawn along these lines between, say, the physical and the moral, any more than one could be drawn between the physical and the logical. So that was just a general sort of overview. We talked about logical, metaphysical, we talked about epistemic or doxastic, we talked about deontic, moral or ethical, and finally we talked about physical or nomological possibility. All of these ways of speaking are rule-governed in a certain sense, but the rules for that kind of talk, each category is very different. And I tried to allude to the fact, and I said it outright in the introduction, that not everyone thinks of these as being discrete. Sometimes metaphysical and logical are collapsed together, for example. The point is, there's lots of room for conversation, but if you get any kind of intuitive fix on these, then the conversation will have served its purpose.